All right. Hello. Happy Wednesday. Happy last day of June. Wrap up to the second quarter for everybody. Welcome to the weekly Route Consultant webinar. For those of you that are here for the first time, we're so excited to have you. For those of you that are here not for the first time and repeat offenders, great to have you again. So we have a lot of fun stuff planned for today. Before I get started, I want to give a really quick disclaimer that those of you know we have to read every week. So Route Consultant is not endorsed by and is not recommended by Federal Express Corporation and FedEx Ground. Route Consultant is not sponsored by, is not approved by, is not associated with, and has no connection whatsoever with Federal Express Corporation or FedEx Ground. All that means is that you're not going to hear any materially non-public information here today that you could use to trade FedEx stock upon. But I'm hoping that you will all receive very competitively useful information here today in terms of being able to familiarize yourself with the FedEx space, whether you're new to the industry and looking at jumping in for the first time, or maybe you're a current contractor that is here just to understand what's happening in the market as a whole and within other contractors across the country. So my name's Annalee Cate. I'm the vice president here at Route Consultant. For those of you again here for the first time, we are large FedEx contractors on the operations side, and then also the largest FedEx route brokers in the country, as well as FedEx consultants. So we do a lot of educational work with new contractors coming to the space and trying to learn about the industry for the first time. And then we also host a ton of really exciting events, some of which we'll talk about here today, and then others you can always find on our website on different ways to engage with us. But again, we really appreciate you being here. So today, what we're going to do, Spencer is actually traveling this week, but it's a perfect time to kind of kick off something that for some of you new to this space might feel really early, but I'll talk to you about why. So we're right here at the halfway mark in the year. And for FedEx contractors, what that means is we're well over the halfway mark towards the point where peak starts to really kick in as contractors. So what we're going to talk about here today is planning for peak season, the ramp up to peak season, and one tool in particular that for new contractors coming into the space is something that we really recommend. So as we dive into talking about peak season, I'm actually going to share my screen here to show you something that we use that we call a peak plan, and some contractors put these together. A lot of contractors don't, but especially for new contractors coming into the space for the first time, I always really encourage you to spend some time and energy building out that peak plan so that one, you're able to kind of set the relationship off on the right foot with FedEx Ground, but also so that you have a good idea of what is going to be required of you in that time frame up until taking over on the operation. So as far as peak plans go, this is just an example of something that we use and provide to a lot of our clients. Let's see. So just Danielle or Brent, can y'all see my full screen there on that doc?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So here's an example of a peak plan. And for us, this peak plan, again, is just about kind of laying out the runway to what it's going to take to actually get the operation up and running and successful during peak season. So we always kind of start with a general idea of what projections we could expect. And this is a great place to actually communicate with the terminal. If you're new to the space and here for the first time and thinking about how you're going to put this peak plan together, you won't actually have access to the terminal typically until you go in for your interview, which is a decent ways into the process if you're just getting started. But with that peak plan, as you're having those conversations with the terminal, you want to have a general idea from the seller of what historic peak patterns have looked like in terms of whether you're looking at a business that has increased by 5%, 10%, 20%. I think we can all agree last year was basically a 100% type of year, at least for most contractors. But from a planning perspective, having that historic data, and then also being able to have a conversation with the terminal to understand what they're anticipating for the upcoming peak season. You know, a lot of times what we find is in interacting with the terminal in those conversations, especially for a new contractor coming in, what we often see is that they're going to over project what they expect you need in terms of resources as an effort to try to help you be successful during that peak season. And in doing so, with that peak season piece, one thing that is really common with that is what we see is new contractors sometimes come into the space overstaffed, which is actually a benefit in that first year because one, you're less likely to have service issues, but also because it puts you in a position to be able to be a contingency resource for other contractors in the building. And what we mean when we say contingency resource is really just the person with the extra trucks and the extra drivers that can come in and bail out other contractors. And there's a significant financial return opportunities available if you can be that resource to other contractors. So that's a really common occurrence. I realized I forgot to say too at the very beginning, just if you'll notice down at the bottom of your screen, I want to make sure if you're here for the first time, you know this, we do this every week, but we have a Q&A feature that if you want to submit questions as we go, I'm going to talk for a few more minutes here and then we'll open up for live Q&A for really the second half of today's webinar. But feel free to use that Q&A feature to start loading in questions that you want to answer, whether it's about peak season or about anything else in the FedEx space. No topic is off limits there, but feel free to just use that Q&A feature, not the chat feature. And I can't believe I forgot to say this. Anybody that's here before knows this is very out of character because I love the question of the day, but one thing that we have as a tradition here at Route Consultant is that in order to actually ask a question and submit it into the Q&A feature, you have to answer our question of the day. And so I'll tell you what that's going to be just so you can start preloading those questions in there. If you've already loaded a question, that's okay. Just go ahead and respond with your answer to today's question, and then we'll still prioritize yours. But we always prioritize the questions for those that answer that for the day. So today's question is actually going to be, as we're moving out of all the COVID restrictions and shutdowns, what is the next concert or show that you have tickets to that you're looking forward to? If you don't already have tickets, what's a show that you would love to go see now that things are starting to open back up? So you'll get to hear my answer. You'll get to hear Danielle's answer as well in a little bit, and then we'll come back and address all of those. But in the meantime, I'm going to jump back into talking about peak season, but just make sure you're using that Q&A feature. So back to volume projections. That's typically what we see from the terminal in terms of trying to anticipate from a volume projection standpoint what that's going to look like. And then the reality usually falls somewhere between what it was last year and what the terminal is anticipating. But you want to have the volume projection there mapped out so you know what to anticipate. Then as we start thinking about peak, I find that there's really three kind of key pillars that if you have a decent strategy in each of these three, you're likely to have a successful peak season. So the first part is generally that kind of safety, service, cultural component to the business in terms of how you're actually training your new team members and existing team members. So one of the challenges with peak season for us contractors is that when we're dealing with that ramp up, what it often means is that we are hiring a seasonal workforce. And so with that seasonal workforce, what you have is a situation where those drivers are coming in without training on the technology, without training within the equipment, within the service area. And so it's not uncommon to have issues with safety during that time. So you're going to see kind of two big distinctions here between your existing driver safety plan and your new driver safety plan. And I'm going to toggle back and forth here. So as you're thinking about those two different strategies and trying to identify that, you really want to create that distinction there in terms of how are you going to take somebody who's new to your team, new to your culture, maybe even new to the industry, and help make sure that they are successful in that peak season portion of operations. And so with that, there's technology components that you want to make sure that you have all of your equipment set up with, so that way you're reducing the probability of incident just via that safety technology. You also want to make sure from a training perspective that you have some sort of new driver curriculum that is really built out to ensure that they learn proper lifting and loading techniques. And, again, just how to safely exit the vehicle, enter the vehicle in order to reduce the likelihood of accidents, as well as, encouraging and making sure they understand that you never want them to back up if you possibly can, right? So some of that's technology, some of that's training. 80% of our preventable accidents in this industry are from backing accidents. And so if you can just keep them from backing up, or at least reduce the likelihood that they run into something when backing up, then you are doing all right. So there's the training piece, the technology piece, and then also culture. So this is a really important one for new buyers to understand coming into the space, but also for for those of you that are trying to reduce safety within the business, creating a culture that doesn't have your drivers haphazardly having accidents, trying to hide or cover things up, feeling a sense of like they're not allowed to share if they do have an incident instead of giving you the chance to be in front of that incident. So making sure that you have that really open communicative culture, and that there's either some sort of positive or negative incentive for drivers to not have accidents and to have an incentive to come alongside you with that mission of trying to have a safe operation. So you want to really look for those three different pillars and making sure that with your new drivers, you're hitting in each of those places on that new driver onboarding experience is really critical. Then also for your existing drivers, sometimes we forget this piece, but as an operator, you've got drivers that might have 6 months, 12 months, 10 years of experience working for you, but it's still really important that they are getting that updated, refreshed information in terms of what to anticipate during that season's peak, and maybe changes within the delivery area or construction zones where they just need to be extra alert, hyper vigilant. Making sure that you're re-emphasizing obviously seat belts and different types of technology that we're using, like anti-theft devices, and just making sure the drivers are really being consistent with those kind of commonplace practices. But when you take drivers and suddenly they're working more days, longer days, everybody goes into it with that all hands on deck mindset, and there's generally a lot of energy around peak season, but you really want to make sure you combat that as well with those reminder safety messages that are consistent with your company culture. So thinking through safety is really important. And then there's also, of course, an element like we talked about from the incentives and penalties to have that. And then the last part with that kind of safety operations side too is just inspection. So making sure that both your new drivers and your existing drivers are reminded and really clear on what that pre and post trip inspection process looks like, so that both their behaviors are safe, but that their equipment is also safe each day as they're looking to dispatch. So really important part. Once you kind of create that initial outline from a safety perspective for the business, the next big piece is really moving down to think about the two pillars that we always talk about in this industry, which is people and trucks. So you've got safety and service as kind of the overarching primary motivation, just for knowing that we've done a job well. But then from an operational pillar to being able to achieve that, you have the people side and the truck side. And so in thinking about the fleet strategy during this time, the big things that we want to think about are primarily rental trucks is kind of the first and foremost topic of conversation. So if you've been tuning in on our webinars over the last few weeks, it's really important that you understand that a lot of our kind of critical auto body dealer manufacturer partners in the space are definitely giving us the nod that it could be a tough peak season this year in terms of being able to source vehicles. Some of that just due to the Ford plant, they haven't produced a chassis in 2 months. One of our key vendor partners was telling us about that. And that's going to absolutely have a ripple effect and implications within the industry on access to fleet. And so making sure that you have an early and secure strategy for how you're procuring your rental trucks. Here, just an example in terms of diversifying between multiple different vendors. There's a lot of different options to choose from there, but having that as a plan. And then, thinking through that timeline. One of the things we're anticipating a little bit with this peak season is that some of the rental companies may kind of require a much earlier pickup date on these vehicles than what we've seen in the past. And some of that just goes to the fact that there's going to be that truck shortage that we anticipate. And they know that if they can require an earlier pickup date, ultimately it's going to cost us more. But we as the contractor are wanting to try to control that cost by not picking up our vehicles too early in the process, because we're going to carry that over that volume ramp up period. But we also want to make sure that we're not waiting till the very last minute to get those vehicles. And then, we show up and unfortunately, we're the ones that don't have a fleet for peak season. So that would be a critical miss. So Rental trucks is a huge solution. If you have the benefit of owning enough vehicles to cover for peak season, then you're in an absolute advantage. But a lot of contractors are not in that situation. And then, making sure that you have a strategy for how you're going to deal with that preventative maintenance, and that it's really clear within the team on how we're going to be keeping those vehicles serviced through peak season, because it's so hard to take them out of operation during that critical push. That's why we see a lot of repair and maintenance tend to happen immediately after peak season in January. But you do want to make sure that you're keeping the vehicles well maintained during that time, so that you don't end up in a situation where you have an unexpected vehicle out of service for significant repairs. And then you're just going to have those day-to-day unexpected changes and repairs. Obviously, if you are engaging frequently with our content, we're big believers in the new truck fleet strategy. So hopefully during peak season, if you've upgraded your fleet like we've been talking to you about over the last year or so, in a scenario like that, hopefully you're not having any major significant repairs during peak season, but we all know that it can definitely happen when you're dealing with these vehicles and the amount of wear and tear and mileage that we put on our equipment. So making sure you have a really good strategy for fleet, and then also just even thinking through from a personnel perspective on fleet, how you're dealing with things like who's going to be shuttling trucks in the event of a breakdown, who's going to be overseeing that preventative maintenance, and kind of how you're getting trucks back and forth to repair shops. All just small details, but if you're new to this space for the first time, you want to really sit down and think through the logistics of what that entails in order to have a successful peak. And then the second pillar to successful operations outside of fleet is obviously around your staffing needs. And so, this, especially in today's climate, is a huge part of the strategy in trying to set up for a successful peak season. And so, this year, many of us contractors are actually already feeling this well before headed into any type of a peak staffing strategy. But with the labor market where it is, the pressure on producing drivers is at an absolute high. Sometimes feels like a bust point. It's much easier in P&D than it is in line haul right now. But even still, the shortage of drivers is going to be, I think, a real threat for this peak season. And so, being able to think through initially the contingency plans that you have for, again, a seasonal workforce that may or may not be as reliable maybe as somebody that's been with you for 3, 5, 10 years from a driver perspective on that attendance. And it is not uncommon to see drivers that we hire during peak season come in and work for a week and say, wow, this is an incredibly challenging, physically demanding job. And they might leave the keys in the truck and you'll never hear from them again. And so in that situation, kind of critical rule all year long, but especially during peak season, is making sure you have a really good understanding of what your contingency plans are going to be during peak. So once you know what your base level of drivers needed is just for operations, and then using the volume forecasts you put together with the current contractor, if you're in the process of buying, and with the terminal on what we think the staffing needs are going to be for that season, and you begin to fill that pipeline, you want to also be recruiting for and continuing to build out that contingency flex pipeline of resources in terms of drivers that like working Saturdays and Sundays, drivers that maybe are, firemen or landscapers that are kind of in their slow season during the winter. And so they're probably more flexible to come take a job as opposed to, during the summertime or the balance of the year. So you want to look for those seasonal industries where you can find those drivers that are willing to just come at the drop of a hat and cover for a day, and maybe you pay a slightly higher wage that day, but it's worth it just to have somebody in the seat so that the packages still get delivered. So you'll have that kind of flex staff, and then the contingency staff, and building out and specifically recruiting for each of those pipelines is really important in terms of building an effective fleet personnel strategy for peak season. So that's a huge part of it. And then, something that is, I would be remiss not to say, is that as a contractor, having a contingency plan for your management is critical, because things happen to managers too. They, have life changes, or they get burnout, and sometimes peak season can be the pinnacle of stress as a new manager coming into the space, or even an experienced manager that's been through a lot of these, if you're going to have an epic peak season like we're anticipating this year. So making sure you have those backup plans and that you're grooming those contingency plans so that you aren't ultimately your contingency plan as a driver and as a recruiter and as a manager, because that perfect storm season could happen where everything that goes wrong can, and in that scenario, it's just kind of setting you up for success. So that ultimately we live and die in this industry by our ability to contingency plan. So thinking that part through is really critical on peak season. And then also making sure that you're really maximizing all of your possible recruiting sources. So of course you want to be your own recruiting solution and driving that force. It's the lifeblood of your business. So having a hand in that is critical, but you also want to make sure that you are looking at all the other solutions. There are third-party recruiting platforms that you can rely on. A lot of those, are going to not be available if you wait until peak season. So having a good long-term relationship with a recruiting solution is really important in terms of having an ability to really build a pipeline and sustain a pipeline, because if you wait until peak season to start, you're probably not going to get a great pipeline or a lot of support within that market. So understanding what your solutions are there. And then also never neglect the importance of having your own employees as your greatest recruiting platform. And so offering referral fees is one of the best ways to build a really stable peak season workforce, because what we generally find is that our drivers have the best understanding of the company culture, the schedule, the physical nature of the position, and the grueling demands on them just emotionally, mentally, physically, schedule wise. So making sure that you're bringing in people that really understand what's required in this job. And typically your drivers are the best at that. Plus they want to reap the benefit of having another great driver and not having somebody that they're having to clean up after and work later days because somebody, didn't know what they were signing up for or quit or something like that. So making sure that, you are really taking advantage of all those recruiting solutions. And then the one other thing that I always think is really important to iron out early when it comes to a peak plan, and I'm sure we could add about a million other things to this, but here are just your absolute must-have components, is sitting down and putting pen to paper on a timeline. And this is something, again, you can, work with us to help put this together. You can also, with this part, work with the current contractor to get an understanding of what their typical ramp time is, and then just build yourself a cushion in, especially if you are a new operator, to make sure that you are not the last one to the ball in a scenario like that. So I think it's really important to go ahead and build out that timeline on, essentially, if you are a new contractor standing up, when you're planning to stand up and be certified in the system to onboard drivers, making sure that you get your ad posted in enough time to build an applicant pipeline, making sure that you also kind of start setting some incremental benchmarks on where you want to be staff and resource wise. And then when you plan to have kind of your first batch of peak hires on board and starting that training process. And again, how many you do, how soon you do it is going to depend a little on your market and what you've seen and how many employees you need. But this is just to kind of give you a general idea on some key things to think through, because there is going to be that training incubation period to actually produce a driver that's capable of operating. And then kind of when your plan is to have that batch all the way through the FedEx approval process, and making sure that you kind of keep that pipeline full, and that you also don't stop. I see this in contractors occasionally that fail, and an important part here is making sure that you don't get to let's say halfway through December and decide, great, we've made it through, we've built a staff, we have enough people to sustain for peak season, and then you continue to sprint your way towards the holiday season, and out of nowhere you have an accident, somebody rolls an ankle and somebody gets frustrated and quits right in the heat of peak, and all of a sudden you're down 3 drivers and you're starting at square one. It's an unfortunate and an easy way to end up with an opportunity to cure letter or essentially a contract service breach from FedEx Ground if one of those things happens. So making sure you keep that recruiting effort really strong all the way through January. And something also to keep in mind, and we've seen this over the years, is that a lot of people think on December 26th we're done and that everything's just going to dissipate and fall right off. But over the last several years, we've seen kind of two unique trends that typically happen. Is one, in January, what we typically see is essentially a buyer's remorse period right after the holiday, where you have a lot of shipping returns. So people that have purchased Christmas presents or holiday presents, and then ultimately they're having to return those during that push. That can have a huge volume spike in the weeks that just follow right after Christmas week. And then the other thing that's important to keep in mind as well when you're thinking about that is, in the past few years, what we have traditionally seen as a surprise, and we're going to see how it goes in a post-COVID world, or as post-COVID as we are, but to be able to look at the trend of volume as we increase towards peak season. In prior years, we've actually seen essentially a leveling off period. We might see a little dip, but that essentially becomes the new normal in a lot of markets over the last few years. And so we'll find out this year if that trend continues, or if we see any type of contraction in volume after the holiday season. But you do really want to be prepared for that type of fluctuation and make sure that you're just anticipating those needs and that you don't let up on those recruiting efforts until you get through that season. And if there is a contraction in volume, that's really your chance to look back at your driver database and figure out who has really been performing at an elite level, maybe who's underperformed, and essentially do some consolidation as needed there based on your current driver resources. So those are some of the big highlights and things that, again, if you're new to the space and just trying to think through how you strategize, even being prepared to take on something like the behemoth that is peak season, some of the things that we've learned the hard way, or that we've helped other contractors kind of avoid some of those landmines. But we are always here as a resource as other questions emerge and things that you want to know about peak season. We're going to answer some of those here today. And then before we dive into the open Q&A component, I want to make sure that I hit the new inventory that we had go live this week. So we had a ton of new opportunities hit on the market today. We've got 12 new listings. I'll give you the kind of quick run through on these, but if you haven't checked out the inventory pages on our website today, you need to definitely look at it. We had 12 P&D routes go live in Huntsville, Alabama, listed at $299. That one does not come with trucks, so you need to make sure you have a fleet strategy there, but you've got great management, a lot of years of experience there in terms of providing transition support, and obviously an incredibly compelling price on that business once you kind of factor in what you need to do on fleet acquisition there. We had 10 P&D routes in Kokomo, Indiana, listed at $400,000. That one actually does come with trucks, and it is only 37% of revenue. You're going to see some of this is what I think we're probably going to start feeling here over the coming weeks is contractors that are really motivated to get out before peak season. That is so normal at this time. We see a big push in January every year, and then another mid to late summer push as contractors start staring down the barrel of what has been an incredible growth year in volume, realizing even if they're just selling off a piece, it's worth it to try to control that growth, raise some capital so that they are really well positioned to head into peak season. So you will definitely see some of that headed into this third quarter. So on that Kokomo opportunity, that again is an experienced contractor. It does need a manager on that one, so that's something you can work with the current contractor on producing, is trying to identify that right candidate. But solid business there, priced really well in Kokomo. Let's see, we've got in the greater Cleveland area in Ohio, we've got 13 P&D routes listed at 1.2 million. That one's right actually at or just below market at only 69% of revenue. Strong margins on that one. Management, it's actually almost a brand new fleet. The majority is 2019 or newer. They've got spare vehicles, spare drivers. That one is poised for that type of contingency work that we talked about at the beginning. And again, has management, and actually this one from an even more attractive standpoint for those of you that are looking at SBA. We do think this one's going to be SBA eligible, and there's some seller financing already on the table on that particular business. So a lot of really attractive components to that greater Cleveland opportunity if you're looking for that. And we're kind of right at that point in the year where, SBA is still doable, but it's going to be an all hands on deck push here across the third quarter to get that done. In Florence, South Carolina, we had 5 P&D routes go live at 675. That's really strong margins on that one. It's over 23% operating income, has a manager in place, very experienced, successful contractors. So you're going to get phenomenal transition support on that one as part of the arrangement, offering some seller financing. Also does have some assumable truck debt on that one. So when you're looking at a price point like that and you put assumable truck debt plus some seller financing in the table, it can really reduce your kind of cash injection into the business. So from a creative structure, that can be really appealing based on your strategy. Also a really low turnover operation on this one. So great way to come into a stable workforce and set yourself up there. I'm going to try to say this. So in Sellens Grove or Sheboygan Dam, Pennsylvania, we had 6 P&D routes listed at 624. So really strong margins on this one. Needs just a couple of vehicles, but primarily complete fleet. So again, check that one out at 624 in Pennsylvania. For line haul, we had 2 line haul runs in Ocala, Florida. Has some spot work with it as well, listed at $599. It's only 94% of revenue, which is really great for line haul. That opportunity is 2 unassigned solo runs, but has really strong operating margins on that one as well in the mid-20s. And then in Rolla, Missouri, we had 18 P&D routes go live at 1.295. Again, that's only 61% of revenue. Really excited to see the pricing on these. And also we believe SBA eligible on the Rolla, Missouri. Comes with management in place, has several spare vehicles as well as a resource for you. In South Windsor, Connecticut, we had 12 P&D routes listed at just over $1 million at $1,025,000, only 65% of revenue on that one. Also think that one might be SBA eligible, has some assumable truck debt, has management in place, and also a really low daily miles territory. So you've got a dense delivery zone. In Atlanta, Georgia, we had 11 P&D routes listed at $999. It's 85% of revenue on that one. Great transition support, has some spare vehicles down there in Atlanta. Another line haul opportunity in Lenexa, Kansas. We had 4 line haul runs at $1.2 million. Again, only 98% of revenue. That's right on the lower end even there for line haul. And has, 2 dedicated, 2 unassigned runs, tenured contractor, newer vehicles on that one. Solid margins. And then the last one this week is Phoenix, Arizona. We had 6 P&D routes listed at $695. Great location, 86% of revenue on that one. We think this is probably going to be SBA eligible, but does also have some assumable truck debt and some seller financing if you're looking to do a creative structure. Has management in place, spare trucks, and another really experienced contractor downsizing there. So awesome. Lots of really fun opportunities this week. I'm so excited to be able to share all of those with you. So that being said, it is time to bring Danielle on so we can dive into our open Q&A component for today, and also to talk a little bit about some of the different questions that you had here. And we're going to go through and make sure that we get all of these answered for you. So before we do that, our question of the day, Danielle, I will go first. So for those of you just signing on, today's question is, now that we are out of some of the COVID shutdowns, what is the very next concert or show that you have tickets to attend that you're looking forward to? Or maybe if you don't have tickets, that you were really hoping to get the chance to go see now that we're getting the chance to reemerge a little bit. So I'll answer. And so mine, I do not have tickets for anything yet, but this question made me say, oh, it's time to start getting back out there and looking. And I'm a big Zac Brown Band fan, and they are doing a show here in Nashville at Bridgestone in September. So I'm going to see if it's not too late to land some of those. So love some Zac Brown Band. What about you, Danielle?
Nice. Cody Johnson will be here next weekend in Lynchburg Festival. So I love Texas country, so I will be there.
Nice.
I'm excited.
Country. And that's like, you came to Nashville, I know, for the country music, but that Texas country is it's a whole nother level too. So that's awesome.
They're both good. Both are good.
Yeah. Good. All right. Well, you like both. We'll take it.
Yeah.
Let's dive into some questions, Danielle. Where do you want to start?
Okay. All right. Let's start with Garth. Garth would like to see JT. He said he's a great entertainer. We have to assume that's Justin Timberlake, right?
Oh, for sure. I have not seen Justin in concert, but I bet he's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good choice, Garth. Garth's question is, there's a lot up in the air as far as payroll, hour violations, and overtime. Can you explain the concerns involving overtime pay and how to structure payroll to be safe?
Yeah, absolutely, Garth. This is a really important question right now. We're spending a lot of time and energy actually talking about this. And in fact, for those of you that haven't had a chance to check out our website, we do an annual expo every year here in Nashville. Our expo is actually at the end of this month. We're so excited. Hopefully that's the next show you come see, actually, but here at the Gaylord Opryland, and hopefully Brent maybe can drop us a link in the chat to that, but it's July 30th and 31st. And so one of the big segments we're going to cover at this year's expo is actually on audit compliance, because this has been such a critical topic for contractors. We've been doing audit consults for the last several months like crazy with all the pressure that FedEx is putting on this. So as far as the payroll piece goes, essentially, where we stand, there's a couple big components. Is first of all, we've been talking for over a year now about trying to migrate our fleets, and we've done this down to over 10,000 pound vehicles. So one of the big issues here is if you are operating a vehicle that's under 10,000 pounds, then you are required by law to pay overtime to those drivers. And so those commercial exemptions don't kick in unless they're in a vehicle that's in excess of that 10,000 pound mark. And so a lot of contractors pay a fixed daily wage. It's the most common method of compensation in the industry. You have a very small percentage that does hourly, and then another really small percentage that's doing kind of a stop incentive pay structure, but vast majority are doing an hourly pay plan. And so with that, I'm sorry, not hourly, a fixed daily wage pay plan. And so with that, if you are just paying drivers by the day and they're even doing like one day in a sub 10,000 pound vehicle, you're gonna have a violation there. So there's a lot of hype around this topic right now. There's legal outstanding issues with FedEx Ground as well. And so it's definitely something that if you're not already in compliance, just give us a call. We can coach you through how to make the necessary changes to make sure that what you're doing is ultimately compliant on that wage and hour piece, and how you're processing that payroll and being compliant with that overtime, and just a handful of other little qualifiers there, but making sure that first and foremost, you understand the under 10,000 pound requirements, and that you're not paying drivers with a fixed daily wage when they should be eligible for that hourly wage. And even more so too on things like your pay stubs, making sure that it doesn't say things like that they've worked, let's say if it says they worked 38 hours that week, but that you actually pay them a fixed daily wage. If it says hours on that pay stub and you're not paying them by the hour, that's going to be a violation too. So all little tips and tricks, but just things you come engage with our team. I know we've got a full-time team of 50 here that spend all day long interacting with both current and prospective FedEx contractors to try to help overcome some of these challenges. So just reach out to us through our website and get in touch with somebody on the team, and we can help solve that one for you, Garth.
Wonderful. Okay, Annalee, next we have Patrick. And he didn't put a concert, but he said he wants to go to a Yankee game with like a lot of exclamation marks. So I think he really wants to go to that game. He's pretty excited about it.
Yeah, I figured I was actually really curious as to whether we would get more like concert submissions or sporting events or speaker comedian type shows. So I'm kind of looking for suggestions, but I bet that the kickoff Yankee game there will be really fun for you, Patrick.
Yeah. And Patrick's question is, how does one get financing for the carve-outs?
Yes. So it's a great question. And just to kind of back up and give a little bit of context here. So this has been a really critical topic that we've been dealing with over really the last about 6 months in the space. So when FedEx made scale guideline changes over the past year and announcements around limiting how large a contractor can be in one particular market, what it really did was motivate a significant percentage of the contractor base to go through and sell off a piece of their business. So not necessarily exit the space, but sell off a chunk of that business in order to scale down and get within those compliance guidelines. Ultimately, I'm not speaking for FedEx Ground, but it's a strategy here of recognizing how much growth is still going to occur even in the wake of COVID, and trying to make sure the contractor base is stable enough to sustain that growth. So as the contractor base scales down, sells off, does capital raises, we're better positioned to be able to handle continued growth and expansion in the space. And so from a carve-out perspective, when we say carve-out, we're referring to a sale that is part of a larger business as opposed to buying a clean full entity. And so a huge percentage of the transactions that we're working on this year are carve-outs, just again motivated by that scale announcement. And so financing has been a real challenge, because if you look at the traditional SBA track, or even a lot of conventional lenders, the comfort level with buying part of a business and not having historic records for a lot of those lenders is really challenging. We are just starting to break through the ice on getting some carve-out transactions through with a few select lenders, but they have to be really clean businesses. And there's actually a handful of other criteria that will eliminate a lot of businesses. And so something that we're working through with our own inventory is figuring out which ones are going to fit in that caliber. So if you're not seeing it say SBA on the website, that one at this time is not going to fit those qualifications. But as we continue to make progress with that, we're going to be relabeling those as SBA eligible if they're still on the market. Hopefully giving those of you that are trying to take a financing approach that path. But I think by January, no doubt, we'll have some solutions that are lenders that are very comfortable processing those carve out funds is my hypothesis. But I think we could have some deals that still happen this year on that as well.
Okay. Next we have Tara, who is also going to a baseball game. She wants to go to the A's this Friday. She's going to the A's game.
Nice.
So that's fun. And she asked, would you please outline some of the positive and negative incentives for avoiding accidents?
Yeah. So, one of the big things that we've done over the years, and the one kind of disclaimer I would put on this is that you need to make sure that you are working with a wage and hour attorney in your state to understand what the requirements are. A lot of times you've got to have certain things in your employment agreement when you actually onboard those drivers in order to be able to do disincentives. So we'll talk about that first, and then we can talk about some of the incentives too. We personally have found more success with the actual disincentives than offering an incentive. It just seems like for our driver base, incentives tend to start to feel like a guaranteed source of income. And so it can actually be more frustrating to them when they don't get the incentive versus if it's kind of not anticipated and either a surprise bonus or a disincentive, that tends to carry a lot more weight, but also create less resentment because there's some ownership in it. So what we have found with the disincentives is that what we'll typically do is if a driver has an accident that is their fault, then we will do a payroll deduction, assuming again it's compliant in your state with wage and hour and it's outlined in your employment agreement. And like a common structure for us is we'll do like a $50 deduction for about a 10-week period, which really helps offset some of the financial implications to us as a contractor based on the accident that they had. But it's going to depend on your labor market and kind of what the total comp package looks like for your particular drivers. And you will have some drivers that will quit over that. So you've got to be in a position where if a driver is going to quit over that, you can provide a solution and have that great recruiting strategy and those contingency plans in place so that you're not beholden to a driver, because once you bend on one, then you've lost all of your footing, just like parenting. So you've lost all of your footing at that point. So it's definitely important on the disincentive piece to hold strong if that's what you're going to do, and then also understanding that oftentimes our driver demographic are kind of paycheck to paycheck. So it's something that you want to work with them on, and we've had to do this in the past with some of our more loyal drivers where maybe it's not the right time to do that, and you could do kind of a smaller deduction over a longer time or something, just again trying to really work with your driver base so that they are in it with you business wise and operationally and understand the implications of that, but that they're also you're being supportive of, to them as the employer too. So that's common. And then on the incentive side, again, we've found more luck with doing kind of a surprise incentive. So maybe having no outline structure, but just walking in one day with gift cards for everybody that's gone 90 days without an accident, and handing out a gift card just to say, hey, thank you. I want to really celebrate and encourage the win here. So thank you for being safe out there. That has been a strategy that we've leveraged as well.
Okay, next we have Dirk, and his answer is Sebastian, I might say this wrong, Sebastian Maniscalco in concert. Maniscalco?
I almost recognize that, but I'm not quite putting it together. So I'm gonna have to look that one up. I love one I don't know because it gives me something to go research afterwards. So
it's a good name, at least. The music must be good. Great. Okay, and Dirk's question is, what are the pros and cons of acquiring a P&D HD business only? And then he said, I thought all routes had been combined, but we are seeing HD routes only for sale. Any concern for long-term growth?
Yeah, so it's a great question. You are right in that the vast majority of current FedEx contracts available today are already what we call overlapped, meaning they have merged and kind of co-located within the station between ground or commercial delivery and the residential portion of the delivery. I see this most often out on the West Coast, where there's still some locations where they have not co-located. And usually it's just because the facilities themselves are not built to be able to handle the other type of volume. So if they've got like a residential facility, they can't handle the larger commercial freight like through that particular building. So that's typically when we see that. But I think it's not so much that there's a lot of exposure there, and really from a growth perspective, in fact, typically the residential volume grows the fastest. The commercial volume is not what's generally producing such a large growth rate. So that being said, I wouldn't see it as any concern around growth. If anything, you'll be, slightly ahead of an overlapped operator in terms of just growth rate, potentially depending on your territory. But the biggest thing is that at some point it's to be expected in the future that they are going to co-locate that location, just based on kind of the history. But whether that's a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, who's to say, just as FedEx continues to upgrade the network. But what I would say is that in terms of just being intimidated by that merger, it's not an overly pleasant process, but every essentially ISP across the country has been through this in the last decade. And so that being said, it's very doable, and it's nothing that should be too terrifying. You just, you do want to know what you're doing through that transition. And there's a lot of people out there that have been through it, us included, many, many, many times. So happy to be a resource when that time comes, but it's nothing that I would see as a major concern.
Next we have John, and he said the best band to see in concert is Weezer.
Oh, that is a good one, man. I haven't heard of Weezer in a long time, but I bet that would be a good show. Okay.
Yeah.
Throwback.
Yeah. The question is, how should a P&D buyer think of capital expenditure when valuing a business? For example, if 2 out of 10 trucks will likely need to be replaced in the next 2 years, how does that reflect in the valuation?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And, because there's really 2 ways that these businesses are valued. So the primary method is as a multiple on the EBITDA. And then the second method being a percentage of the total revenue. Because those are really based on the last 12 months financials. And because from a valuation perspective, we're typically looking at an EBITDA reflection on that net income, there's really not an impact per se on the valuation from a CapEx perspective, because we all have CapEx. As far as at least growth goes and keeping up with the business, you generally want to budget like, you know, for an 8 to 10 truck operation, like a $50,000 kind of CapEx budget just to keep up. And that's probably, you know, as if we keep growing the way that we are, that will start to be a conservative number and you'll want to expand that. But as far as if you immediately need to upgrade the condition of some of the fleet, that generally tends to manifest in a movement on the multiples. So if we, you know, we see about an average of a 4.3 times multiple, and that is for an average but complete fleet in the space. And so as you see businesses that are listed with essentially a brand new fleet of trucks, that's where you see those operations start to swing towards that 5 times multiplier, versus as you look at businesses maybe that are short with there not enough trucks to complete the fleet, or you know, some of the trucks are, you know, in excess of 500,000 miles and just, you know, well beyond disrepair. In that scenario, you would see it start to swing below that 4.3 to 4.5 times multiplier. So that's what we generally see in terms of fluctuation on that multiple based on the earnings.
Okay. Next we have Reynold, and he would like to go to a movie theater, blockbuster movies like Top Gun, James Bond, Dune, etc.
Nice. The one, you know, I'll tell you the one thing that they have out near my house and I wanted to go so bad and I just never made it was a drive-in. I don't know if it's the last time, but those I feel like made a big comeback as movie theaters were closing down over the last year, but like drive-in theaters seem to like really reemerge, playing a lot of the oldies and the goodies too. So
that's so fun. That's a good one. And the question is, can you talk about attributes of good drivers versus attributes of the bad drivers you want to avoid for hiring process?
Yes. So priority number one is, do they come to work? No, I mean, I think that is definitely one of the most critical just pieces is that reliability. And I think that it's something it's so hard to interview for. And to identify, you know, based on someone's background. But I mean, your best drivers are those that reliably show up to work and they don't always have a reason why they're not going to be there, or, you know, they're absolutely giving you that 2 weeks headwind as opposed to just calling out unexpectedly. That's kind of mission critical. You know, I think a couple other things that immediately come to my mind is, you know, you definitely want drivers that have an ambitious go-getter attitude. And so there's, as you're evaluating the efficiency of each route, you're looking at, for each driver that dispatches, you know, based on how many miles they're driving, how far they go, you know, what is their stop count that they're achieving within that route. And so how many actual stops are they making? And so because we don't, you know, typically pay by the stop, we typically pay on a fixed daily wage, as I mentioned earlier. In that scenario, you want a driver that you can go to and say, you know, here is the daily minimum threshold that I'm expecting. And then hopefully have a driver that has that motivation to really show up and drive towards that daily threshold. And, you know, maybe even a driver that's, as they become really proficient at hitting that particular target threshold, you can actually offer them more money to increase and bump that threshold because they're hungry. They, you know, they want to push, they want to go, because ultimately, as you get that efficiency in each individual route, that, you know, compounds out over the broader business. So that's a critical piece, is having, I think, that hunger within a driver. And, you know, then I think one of the other important pieces is just from a communication standpoint and a respect for authority. That's really from a customer service perspective and a management perspective, and also a FedEx Ground perspective. You know, you want employees in this industry that have respect for you and the management and are communicative and, you know, going to be as professional as we could hope for in that scenario, but also are going to be reliable when they're interacting with FedEx Ground terminal staff and terminal personnel. And then when they're out representing both the broader FedEx Ground brand, but also your personal company's brand, that they're going to be, you know, mature and professional and, you know, client service focused. in interacting with customers. And, so just having that kind of positive go-getter attitude is, those are the intangibles, but they're the parts that, most other things you can teach with the right type of driver. So.
Next, we're going to jump to Raj's question, and Raj didn't answer our question about the concert. So I'm going to steal someone else's answer that didn't ask a question. Ty said Saints and Cowboys football game. So thank you, Ty, for saving Raj. So now I'll answer Raj's question.
I'm going to remember that trick for next week, Danielle. That's great. You did the little swip.
Yeah, they're helping each other. It's wonderful.
That's right.
Community. So Raj, this is a perfect question for us, and I could even answer this one, which is shocking. I have no clue in this business, but very interested in getting started. Can you please tell me a step-by-step guide of how to get started?
Yeah. What would you say, Danielle?
I would send him to our new investor summit. I think he should attend that.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. I always feel like that's just the best place for somebody to start. So a little more on the new investor summit. So I talked at the beginning on some of the events that we do. There's a lot of ways to engage. I mean, and if you need to test it out a little more too, just make sure you check out the FedEx 101 course on our website. It is a free virtual e-course that literally costs you nothing. It's hours and hours of that foundational content to just make sure that you understand the terminology and some of the basic critical expectations in the space. And, once you have that vocabulary and a comfort level with the industry, she is absolutely right that new investor summit is the best place to go. And it's essentially a one-day crash course. We have them virtual, but we also, starting this fall again, we're going to have some in-person opportunities here in Nashville where you come and spend a day with us, the route consultant team. And all day you'll hear Spencer Patton, founder of the company. You'll listen to our chief operations officer, our CFO, and hear them talk about kind of those critical management pieces of how to actually be successful on a day-to-day basis in the business. And it's like drinking from a fire hose that day, but you will leave that day really understanding if this is right for you and where to get started. And then if that's the right fit, just engage with our team and we can kind of send you down a variety of different paths to, to find the right place for you to get started in the space, no doubt. And I think Brent just dropped a link there. I won't talk about it a ton just because I want to make sure we get questions, but please check out the links in the chat feature to read more about those.
Okay. And Raj has a second question. Do I need to be in the same state where I buy FedEx businesses, or can I operate it remotely?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a great question. You absolutely do not need to be in the same state where you are buying. For some people, that's the right strategy, and that's kind of where you should start. But as I mentioned earlier, so we have about 275 trucks on the road, and so they're out of 10 different states. Obviously, each of those is not where we live. Our whole office is based here in Nashville, Tennessee. So we're all over the Northeast and central to mid-America. So that being said, we actually don't even have any routes in Nashville. So that's kind of the funny coincidence of that. But for some people, that's the right decision. So it can absolutely be done. It's really just about understanding what your expectations of the business are and what role you hope to play within the business. And then also making sure that you have the right resources. And again, I'll say the magic word, contingency plans in place for staffing and vehicles and management on site. So it can be doable, but it's really about understanding all the critical pieces, but you definitely don't have to.
Okay. I think we have time for one more, right? We have Doug and Dora. They would like to see Elton John or Foo Fighters or together. Imagine if they were together.
That would be that would be a great show. Yeah, we had we do a private consulting client webinar every Monday, and we had like 5 people say Elton John this week, I think, and it was that was definitely the most popular submission, no doubt, this week. So I would love to see Elton John. So Foo Fighters too.
Yeah. Their question is, what performance metrics does FedEx look at? Hopefully not the 30 Amazon measures weekly.
That's right. Yeah. No doubt. Yeah. And you could pick 1 or 2 more questions too, Danielle. We can stay a little bit longer. So for Doug and Dora, so I've actually been spending a lot of time lately understanding and learning more about that Amazon model. So I completely understand from a metric perspective, but FedEx has a handful of things that they really look at, but they kind of recently rolled out for what they're calling kind of key performance indicators. And so that has in some ways started to take over the narrative on what they care the most about. But, you know, what's interesting about FedEx, and this is a huge difference between, I would say, FedEx and Amazon, is from a FedEx perspective, they're, you know, kind of have a mission in a lot of ways of staying out of the day-to-day operations. And so if ultimately you are meeting service and staying within that, you know, 99% service threshold, that is going to be the most important part. But if at the same time you're letting safety fail and you're having an excessive number of incidents, that's where you're going to start to really get into some trouble in one of those two areas. So there's a lot of different kind of little pieces to look at, but those are the two big ones. And then what you could always ask for is you're actually interacting with a contractor or trying to understand those is they have a scorecard that is newer. And in a lot of ways, it does kind of mirror some of the Amazon structure that they call their CSP performance indicators. So the VEDR KPIs that I talked about, but the CSP performance indicators, there's about 12 metrics on that side that are really straightforward on things like, again, that service percentage, how many accidents you're having, your pickup windows. So whether you're meeting or missing those pickup windows, whether you're having the driver, you know, signature releases where basically they're dropping packages off that require signature and not doing those, hours of service violations. You know, those are some of the big ones, but there's about 12 little individual things, and you can just ask for that CSP performance indicator page.
We have TV, who has more of a commentary than a concert. Has never been to a concert. Live music never sounds as good as the songs on the radio, and paying $18 for a hot dog is not for them.
That's right. I can appreciate that. I like going to the shows. I'm a radio person. I'm like, I don't even have the fancy stuff on my phone when I drive. I love to listen to the radio too, actually, because I think it's the surprise spontaneity. So I'm absolutely still a radio listener. We might have to do that for a question next week, but I'm a radio listener too, TV.
That's awesome. So TV asked about staffing for P&D, because you had mentioned that it is easier to staff for P&D for rather than line haul, and TV was just curious about that. Why is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. So a kind of couple big indicator or factors here affecting the demand in that. And so from a P&D driver perspective, with that driver demographic, first of all, you know, they have to have a for-hire endorsement on their licenses, but they're not, they don't have to have like a CDL of any kind, versus on the line haul side, you know, you're talking about a CDL driver. And so that's one of the biggest distinctions, is the CDL pool is just a lot smaller than the gen population out there. And it's really easy to get that F endorsement on your license. So that's one of the biggest components. But then really from a kind of more macro perspective, if you think about where we're going as an economy, you know, we're coming off of a few decades where when we were kids, our parents were not telling us to go be truck drivers. You know, they were saying, go get a college degree, go get a degree, go to school, and, you know, build all this fun college debt. And so instead, they, you know, not being sold on, hey, go travel the country and you know, make six figures driving around the world in a semi truck, which is what a lot of our drivers are making now. It's just, we did not produce it. So we are some like 5,000 CDL drivers short across the country right now. It's just a staggering number. And the problem is getting worse as that kind of CDL driver demographic is, you know, dying off. I mean, we're legitimately seeing a decline in the eligible candidate pool there. And so we're just not producing them fast enough. So that's going to be a huge continued challenge in the line haul side, is just sourcing those drivers versus the P&D side, where you're seeing a real migration towards this kind of gig economy type employee base, that maybe they're, you know, bartenders or firefighters some days of the week, but they want to have like a couple of days off, or they want to go drive for Uber or drive for, you know, Postmates and have that kind of flexible schedule. And those employees make amazing delivery drivers. And so being able to kind of piece that together, even if it's in a flex schedule where they're only working a couple days a week, that has just been an easier proposition to fill in our current market. So, and I know we're 5 minutes already over 4:30. So again, thank you guys all so much for being here and hanging out. We'll do one more question, Danielle, and then we'll call it a day. But I just want to try to get as many as we can, but appreciate you all being here.
Hey, Annalee, I do want to clarify that Class A CDL shortage is going to be 400,000, not 5,000. So it's a big deal.
Right. I knew that sounded better. That's right. Thanks, Brent.
Okay, one last question from Diana, and she didn't put a music answer. What makes the routes available for SBA eligible? That's a good question.
Yeah, so and kind of back to what we were talking about earlier, one of the big pieces, historically has been whether or not it's a carve out. So that's kind of one of the big qualifiers, and just then the quality of the historic financials in terms of showing enough cash flow to cover the required debt service on the business. And then kind of the other big eliminating factor there oftentimes is length of ownership. So, we typically need to have like at least a year of historic financials for the SBA, if not 3 years of history on the business. And so in this space, because of how frequently contractors are selling and busting off a new piece, and they're growing and they're scaling and they're building these out, that can lead to contractors also going in and taking over new territories, and then basically generating that return on the resale. And so the tenure is important. You got to make sure it has a long enough tenure to be eligible for that SBA. So those are kind of the big 3 qualifiers, is that the cash flow component from a debt service perspective, the availability and cleanliness of the records, and with that, the whether it's a carve out or not historically has been a big topic. And then also just the length of ownership there. Okay, so that's all of them. I know we didn't get to all the questions, we never do, but it's 4:37, so I appreciate again all of you being here and hanging out with us. Come see us again next week. Spencer will be back in office with some great new topics, and just as always, we really appreciate all of you and are excited to see you again next week. So take care, everybody. Bye.
Bye, everybody.